Well, our speaker today is Dr. Bill Harley. He has a PhD. He is known as the author of the internationally best-selling book, His Needs, Her Needs. We've given away several copies of these over the past couple of months, and at the end of the presentation today, we'll give away 2 more copies of this book. Over 2 million copies of His Needs, Her Needs have sold, and it is a beautiful book. I should say over 4 million copies have been purchased, available in 22 foreign translations as well. Dr. Harley earned his PhD degree from the University of California at Santa Barbara in 1967, and he's been a licensed clinical psychologist in Minnesota since 1975. For the first 10 years after earning his degree, he taught psychology at both the graduate and the undergraduate levels, and during those years, he was also a frustrated part-time marriage counselor with little success in helping couples. And anybody who has practiced in that field probably has a similar story. In 1973, he discovered that he was not alone in his failure to save marriages. Almost anyone in the marital therapy profession was also failing. So he spent the next 2 years designing an entirely new approach. And when his success skyrocketed in 1977, he resigned from his teaching position to counsel full-time. And I could go on and on. There's an incredible biography about him at his Marriage Builders page. But I just want to speak from personal experience. So it was 1996, and I was a youth pastor at a church in Moline, Illinois, who was living life with all the wrong priorities. My poor wife would ask me, "What time are you coming home for dinner?" And I'd say, "I'm coming home at 5:15, and 6 o'clock, I'm still not showing up for dinner." And then she'd say, "Can we just meet about calendar and talk about what your week looks like?" And I was so focused and really having an affair with my job and not paying attention to my family and the needs that they had. And our marriage was a wreck. My wife started to experience some panic attacks, and I was like, I'll do anything I can to fix my wife. And I realized that the issue was me. But it took me a while. You know, I would have probably been like the people that Dr. Harley talks about that were frustrating him as a marriage counselor. We went to a marriage counselor, and he was doing everything he could to work with me, and he only got so far. And then Ken and Jerry Cook, these beautiful volunteers at First Evangelical Free Church in Moline, Illinois, went to a seminar on basically bringing the His Needs, Her Needs Bible study to your own church. And they decided to do this Bible study. And my marriage counselor had convinced me enough that I needed to join a small group, and this one was on marriage. And so I said, yes, I'll go with my wife. She was like, miracle. My husband, who, you know, is a pastor, is actually willing to go to a small group, because for the first 7 years of our marriage, I was like, forget it, I'm not going to a small group. I'm an introvert, and I want nothing to do with a small group, and I don't want to be honest with people about my feelings in church. And I remember we would take the book, and Dr. Harley actually has the edition I used of the book. This is a newer edition. And my wife had a pink highlighter, and I had a blue highlighter, and we'd highlight, and we'd talk about what we highlighted, and sometimes we'd highlight the same thing, and it would turn purple. But I remember, you know, having to stand before that class on the week that said that she wants openness and honesty in a relationship, and having to look at my church and say, your youth pastor's a liar. And I just remember breaking down. I was so ashamed. I was weeping, but the Lord began to break me at that moment. And our marriage hasn't been perfect. No marriages throughout the years, but we were saved, I believed, and our marriage was saved in great part due to this book. So Dr. Harley, thank you for the courage that you had to write that. I'm somebody whose life was changed by your work, and I can't wait to hear from you. So would you welcome Dr. Bill Harley, and his precious wife Joyce is there. By the way, as he's coming up, they do have a daily podcast that you can check out as well, and they have a great website we'll talk about later on.
I brought some of the copies of books that have been printed over the years, and let me show you the one that he actually used. This is the one. This is the very first one. This came out after that. And then we had this one that's more recent, and then finally this one came out 2 years ago. There's actually, I rewrote His Needs, Her Needs, I think every year. It came out in 1986, and every year I went to the editor and said, you know, I want to change something in here because I'm getting feedback from people. They don't like this example that I'm using. And they don't like exactly how I said that. And so I rewrote it. And so for a while, I kept every copy of every rewrite. And since I've lost, I don't have them all anymore. But the basic idea is there's probably 30 of them. And the book has been out since '86, so it's almost 40 years now that it's been out. It's still selling a lot. It's doing really good. The question is, what in the world did I have in mind that made that book so popular? Because I'm not a writer. The lowest grade I got in college was in English. And I would have been summa cum laude if I hadn't gotten such poor grades in English. The basic idea was that I was a science major, math major. I liked science. My father was a psychologist, and I thought psychology is witchcraft. And they didn't know what they were doing. Nobody was being helped. And as a scientist, I felt that psychology had a long way to go before they would ever get into a position where they would be able to help anybody. So basically, how in the world did I ever get into marriage counseling with that kind of an attitude? Well, people came to me with their marital problems. I had my PhD. I was teaching. And they came to me with marriage problems. And they, can you help me with our marriage? I did not advertise. I didn't solicit. I didn't tell people I was interested in doing marriage counseling. But they would come to me. And I felt the Lord was calling me to figure this out, that this would be my ministry. This would be something that I would do. And so I started counseling people, and as Chris mentioned, I was a failure. Nobody got helped. Everybody got divorced. And they got divorced. And I was thinking, you know, I'm doing more harm than good. I mean, if I just left them alone, they probably would have ignored each other and gotten through life still married, you know? But because of my intervention, I was able to mix it up to a point where they decided that they better get out of each other's way and get divorced altogether. So I became aware of the fact that you can actually do more harm than good when you're into marriage counseling. So I took a 2-year internship, actually went to, here in the Twin Cities, worked at a marriage therapy company that advertised 90% success rate. I discovered that not only did they not have a 90% success rate, but the owner of the company, while I was working there, got divorced. So basically, I felt I got the blind leading the blind. Nobody knows what they're doing here. And so I had at Bethel College, where I was teaching, students that were perfect subjects for my question, what does it take to have a great marriage? One of the things that I noticed about marriage was that nobody ever got divorced if they were in love. Now, I am very familiar with what being in love feels like, because I've been in love with my wife, Joyce, for the 61 years that we've been married, plus the 6 years we were dating prior to that, because I fell in love as soon as I saw her. I saw her at a party. She was wearing a bathing suit. She was 13 years old. I was 14, and I was in love. I couldn't get her out of my head. I have to be with this girl. I know what love is. I feel it. I have felt it. And I know that when you're in love, divorce is out of the question. It's out of the question. And so my question then to myself was, maybe the way to save marriages is to help people learn how to fall in love with each other. I was reading a lot of books on marriage that told me that you can't expect to be married for more, or you can't expect to be in love for more than 2 or 3 years after you're married. And these were famous marriage therapists that said that what you needed to focus on was commitment. You had to be committed in your marriage. And after a while, the passion would die down. You wouldn't be as excited about being with each other anymore, but that was something you had to expect to see happen. And I'd read stuff like that, and I'd say, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with Joyce? Here we are 10 years into our marriage, and we're crazy about each other. We're very much in love. What are we doing that's different than what other people are doing? I didn't know. I didn't have the answer. So what I did was I went to a lot of people who were in love and people who weren't in love. And I asked them a lot of questions about what is it that keeps you in love with each other? Because I think I've got a handle on maybe what would save marriages. If I could teach people how to fall in love and stay in love, maybe I could save marriages. Well, if you've ever been to a college campus, you have the perfect environment for a study on romantic love, because you have a host of people falling in love and falling out of love and falling in love. Joyce, of course, didn't feel the same way toward me that I felt toward her when I saw her in her bathing suit. And I did, in fact, date her throughout the years, but she broke up with me 6 times. Now, if she'd been in love, she'd have never broken up with me once. So I had to safely assume that Joyce was not in love with me. I was in love with her. She's not in love with me. It did not deter me, however. I had to figure out, okay, what can I do to get her to feel toward me the way I felt? So to some extent, I was my own example of how this should work, but I didn't know what it was. So I asked these students that I had, and I asked people that were coming to me for counseling for marriage that I wasn't very successful at, what is it that causes you to feel in love? What is it that triggers your feeling of love? There was no research on the subject that I could find. And I began thinking, okay, look, you're a psychologist, you've been to graduate school, you got a PhD. Figure it out. Figure it out. So I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to do something that has never been done before. I'm going to create a theory about romantic love that is based on Pavlov's principle. Now, do you know anything about Pavlov? Pavlov had a dog. And Pavlov had an experiment where he said that if you associate food that causes salivation with another stimulus like a light or something like that, if you pair the two together, the food and the stimulus of light together often enough, the light will create salivation. I wonder if romantic love is like that. Now you might think to yourself, this guy's nuts, you know. How could he be standing up in front of us and thinking about dogs salivating? And I'm thinking, that's the way it kind of seemed to me, though. I mean, the feeling of romantic love just seemed automatic. It just seemed like salivation almost. I mean, it's like it's what you do under certain conditions. And so I started thinking to myself, okay, what might it be? What might it be? And I thought, okay, what I'm going to do is go to some trouble to find from people something about what makes them happy. And I had the idea that maybe if somebody makes you happy enough, what it does is it breaches some kind of a threshold where now you experience romantic love. I did a lot of studies on what is romantic love, what triggers it, what makes it go away, and I came up with the concept of the love bank. And the love bank is something that all of us have. It makes us associate people with feelings that we have that are good, that when they are associated with good feelings, what I call love units get deposited into their account. It's an unromantic concept, actually, but it's kind of the way I am as a person. I'm more mathematically oriented, I'm more scientifically oriented. As much as I study romance, I'm not, I don't know if Joyce would agree to this or not, but I'm not a terribly romantic person. I'm more clinical. I more think about the details. Maybe the association of good feelings creates enough love bank deposits that you're going to breach something called the romantic love threshold, and by breaching that threshold, you end up triggering romantic love. I wonder if that's possible. I wonder if that happens. So I start asking people, what could someone do that would make you the happiest? And I put it in the context of marriage. I just asked probably 200 people, what could your spouse do that would make you the happiest? What would deposit the most love units? And a lot of people didn't know. If you ask a lot of people that have been married as long as Joyce and I have been married and they don't have any background in marriage counseling or anything like that, and you say, what is it that made your marriage work? Well, they think, we never went to bed mad at each other. Well, is that it? I've counseled a lot of people that have been mad at each other for 5 years straight. They can't go to bed not married mad to each other. I mean, they are married all the time to each other. Okay, so I think, how do you do that? How do you go to bed not being mad at each other? Well, I assumed that nobody knew. Nobody knew what made marriage work, but they knew what the spouse did that made them the happiest. And so I started writing all this stuff down. And then I came up with categories, and I had students help me with the categories. And we came up with categories. We came up with affection. Affection. When my spouse gives me a hug, it makes me feel good. We came up with intimate conversation. When my spouse talks to me about me, and when my spouse is curious about me and what I'm doing and how I'm feeling and what I'm thinking, that makes me feel good. When we go out on a date together and we're doing something fun, that makes me feel good. When my spouse is honest and open, like Chris mentioned here, that makes me feel good. When my spouse helps me with the kids and we're involved in family activities, that makes me feel good. When my spouse helps me with the housework, the dishes, that makes me feel good. When my spouse admires me, tells me I'm doing something great, that makes me feel. I came up with 10 categories of things that spouses did for each other that made each other feel good. So I gave those categories names: affection, intimate conversation, recreational companionship, sexual fulfillment, honesty and openness, physical attractiveness. All of these categories had names, and then I defined the names and I came up with a questionnaire, the emotional needs questionnaire. And from that, when I would get a couple come in, I would say, tell me what makes you the happiest. Here's the list of possibilities. And they would come in and identify the 10 needs that were the most important for them, that would make the most love bank deposits. And my assignment then for each spouse was to meet each other's top 5 emotional needs. There are 10 of them. You only have to meet 5. But you got to meet them, and you got to be good at them. I wrote the book, His Needs, Her Needs, to teach people how to meet those needs. So what happens is your spouse fills out a questionnaire. I have the need for intimate conversation. Okay, what is that? There's a chapter on that. What is intimate conversation? Your spouse looks at the chapter, says, yep, that's it. That's what makes me happy. So, as Chris was mentioning, I encourage people to use magic markers and different colors, and they communicate to each other just by reading the book. This is what I need. I need you to be really good at doing this for me. It makes me very happy when you do this. Now, I also came along with a little test. I have a little test. I'm a research guy. I wanted to know whether it really works. And so I created a test that I call the Love Bank Inventory. It's only 20 items. I give it away to people. People can use it free of charge. I don't charge anything. I wrote a book called Effective Marriage Counseling. It's in that book, so anybody can use that test. But my question is, when I'm counseling this person, what's happening to their love bank? And the test tells me what the love bank balance is. And to me, it's remarkable that people don't cheat on that test. For one thing, I don't want their spouse to know what I get to know what the results are. The spouse doesn't, their spouse doesn't know. But they're honest. And I see this number creeping up. And at a certain point, I look at them and I say, you're in love, aren't you? I am in love. And I haven't felt this way since I married my spouse. And the test gives me feedback as to whether or not this is actually happening. Now, I give you all of this as kind of background information about what I try to achieve in marriage. I try to accomplish the creation and sustaining romantic love. And I've done this ever since probably 1978, something like that. And I didn't write His Needs, Her Needs until 1986. And what had happened was that I was already using this method to counsel people, but I didn't ever consider myself to be much of a writer. And so I gave a talk. I was at First Baptist of White Bear Lake, which is now Eagle Brook. And I was giving a little class Sunday school class on marriage. And so I had the 10 emotional needs. And I presented that in class. And the Christian Ed director of the church recorded that. They gave me the recordings. I started passing out recordings of what I gave of those 13 weeks. One of my clients had one of these tapes, 13 tapes. She transcribed the 13 tapes for me, typed them all up, said instead of giving them as a tape, why don't you give them as something you can read? Okay. And then one of my clients turned out to be somebody that worked for Revell. And he grabs these 13 chapters and hands it to the acquisitions editor, Fritz Ridenour, and they publish His Needs, Her Needs. And if that isn't God's leading, I don't know what is. Because I never asked anybody to publish this for me. It all fell in my lap. Now, I've published a lot of other books too, but at the same time, this was a miracle. I think this was a miracle. First of all, how I came to this point, how I as a person who basically thinks of psychology as witchcraft becomes a psychologist and actually thinks about how to restore romantic love to marriage, where I'm a more stoic person than that. And I got to some extent, I got to give Joyce credit, because if it hadn't been Joyce, I may not have ever been in love. And if I hadn't been in love, I wouldn't have known what people are missing in their marriage and what keeps the marriage secure and tight. All of this happened, I think, as part of God's leading. I, interestingly enough, wanted to become a minister. I went to enroll in seminary, and 2 weeks before we were to start classes, I brought Joyce with me. We were already married by then, and she said, "I just don't want to go. I don't want to go." It wasn't because she didn't want to be a minister. You know, she was happy with me being a minister. She just didn't want to go to that particular city, which happened to be Pasadena, and it was a very smoggy day, and she was in tears. She didn't want to leave her home, and she didn't want to go to a smoggy place. And my attitude is, if the Lord wanted me to be a minister, Joyce would have been on board, and he would have made the day clear. There would have been sunny skies. Joyce would have been happy, and I said, I'm not going to be a minister because Joyce isn't with me. That decision created the environment for me to write what I think is one of the most important concepts in marriage, and that is romantic love. Now, let me tell you the other side of the coin, because there are two sides of this. I am an idealist. And when I first started marriage counseling, I told people that the reason that you don't divorce is because it's God's will that you don't divorce. And that should be reason enough. If you are a follower of Jesus Christ, why on earth would you ever get a divorce when Jesus makes it so clear that you are to be married for the rest of your life? And that's the approach that I took. And everybody got divorced. Now, my attitude is, well, they're not Christians. But they were Christians. Pastor of my church got divorced. My idealism tells me that marriage is a relationship of mutual extraordinary care. I want you to think about that. I want you to write it down. I want you to memorize it. Marriage is a relationship of mutual extraordinary care. It's what Jesus Christ wants us to do as his creation. He wants us to care for each other. Jesus says that we are to be known by the love we have for each other, by the care we have. And when we're married, this is the person that I give a double dose of care to. I'm going to care more about this person that God has assigned me to in life than anyone else on earth. And you know what happens when you do that? When you provide extraordinary care, that person will fall in love with you. See, and so it's two sides of the same coin. In other words, what I've been able to discover is what extraordinary care looks like. What does it look like? It's the meeting of the most important emotional needs of the other person. Now, I also have two other categories. One is you don't hurt each other. Extraordinary care is you don't hurt each other. I've written a book called Love Busters. That you don't do anything selfish to make you happy at the expense of your spouse. And you make your decisions with that person in mind. That's the third thing. The book I wrote was He Wins, She Wins. Those are the things that create extraordinary care. That's what extraordinary care is. You meet each other's emotional needs. You don't do anything to hurt each other. You make all your decisions jointly because you care for each other in an extraordinary way. But you know what happens when you do that? When you do that, you fall in love and you stay in love. And so romantic love is a litmus test. It's a way of figuring out whether I am actually caring for my spouse in an extraordinary way. I can look at my spouse and, do you love me? Do you love me? Are you passionately in love with me? If you are, I'm doing a pretty good job caring for you. If you're not, there's some things I need to learn. There's some things I need to get to be good at to trigger your feeling of love for me. And in the process of doing that, I am accomplishing Christ's will for my life. See, I put those two things together. So I'm not just a numbers guy. I'm also somebody that looks at life through the eyes of Jesus Christ. And as far as I'm concerned, in marriage, you should care for each other in a most extraordinary way. And in the books that I've written, I show you how to do that. I show you how to be an extraordinary, caring spouse. Now, some of the things that I encourage people to do right away when they start looking at this, they say, well, this is not going to be easy. And some of it isn't. But in the final analysis, all of our skill development has come with a price. I mean, everything we do that is we do well, we had to learn. Tom Landry said that coaching is getting people to do things they don't want to do so they can be what they want to be. Getting people to do what they don't want to do so that they can be what they want to be. That's what I do when I counsel a couple. I tell them, I want you to care for your spouse in an extraordinary way. And this is what I want you to learn how to do. But I don't have the time for it. It's just not interesting to me. And I say, well, in the final analysis, I want it to be fun. I want it to be interesting. I want it to be something that's sustainable. But for now, I want you to commit yourself to it. I have 3 rules. Okay? Got my rules here? Write them down. Policy of joint agreement. Policy of joint agreement. Why is that a rule for extraordinary care? Never do anything without what's the word? Enthusiastic. That's the word I'm looking for. Never do anything without an enthusiastic agreement between you and your spouse. Policy of joint agreement. It is a caring rule. When you break that rule, you don't care about your spouse. You care more about yourself. Every violation of the policy of joint agreement is an example of self-indulgence at the expense of your spouse. So it's rule number 1, never do anything without a enthusiastic, I can't remember them, enthusiastic agreement between you and your spouse. Then I also have another rule that Chris knows all about, policy of radical honesty. Never say or do anything that's dishonest. Let your spouse know everything about you. Don't hide anything from your spouse. That turns out to be another act of extraordinary care. And then I've got a third rule that is the toughest one. It's called the policy of undivided attention. Spend a minimum of 15 hours every week giving your spouse your undivided attention, where you are meeting 4 emotional needs: affection, intimate conversation, recreational companionship, sexual fulfillment. You're to be alone. You are not to bring your cell phone with you. You are to give undivided attention to your spouse, a minimum of 15 hours a week. This is where Tom Landry's advice comes in handy, because what I tell people when I first tell them this is the rule, 15 hours of undivided attention every week. They say, well, I can't do it. I said, you can do it. It's just that you have other things that are more important to you than your spouse. Well, I mean, I got to feed my kids. I got to work. Look, 40, 50 hours of work a week is enough. You have 112 waking hours. Let's budget your time. Let's budget your time in terms of things that are really important. And let's put the 15 hours of undivided attention at the top of the list. They can do it. And I make them do it. I make them spend 15 hours of undivided attention. You'll read about that in His Needs, Her Needs. If you've already read it, Chris already knows about my 15 hours of undivided attention. And he knows about the policy of radical honesty. He knows about the policy of joint agreement. Those are things you do when you care for your spouse in an extraordinary way. And so as a marriage counselor, what I'm thinking I am is more of a coach. I'm a coach. I get people to do things that they don't always want to do at first, so they can be what they want to be, and that is in love with each other, caring for each other in an extraordinary way that works for both of them at the same time. So now we have a time for Q&A.
Dr. Harley, a hand. That was awesome. And there are a lot of you here today